Morning, everybody. Today I'd like to kind of do a little bit of a wrap up on the last chapters of Ezekiel, where we're talking about the vision of the temple and of the New Jerusalem in 40 to 45. And particularly with the idea of the temple as a vision, we want to look at this and look at the ways that the approach to the text really matters and how we read it. You may have run across the idea of redaction criticism. In other words, people who are trying to decide which part of the book was original and maybe this part was added later. And they would see this as part of the production of the book. I tend to take a little bit more of what would be called a canonical approach. In other words, looking at the function of this section within the whole book, where we can look at the idea of how Ezekiel relates to the temple from front to back, because the book is, after all, the way we find it now in the canon. And it's a book that's the same within a Jewish Bible and within a Christian Bible. So we don't have a lot of change going on there. But we've looked at the text world approach, where we've looked at time, location, characters, and objects. And looking at this section of text that way, we find out that we have some interesting characters. We have the character of Ezekiel, and then he's being led around in this activity of measuring by his interlocutor who is divine to a certain extent. So it's an interesting interaction between the characters. Their activity is also very interesting because they're walking around and measuring and deciding and describing these spaces. Interestingly, though, when we come to the idea of objects, this is one of those portions of text where you go, what in the world are all these objects doing? And particularly the large object, which is this temple. Because the temple is not fully described. It sounds in a way kind of like a blueprint, but not exactly like a blueprint, because we have some places that are more fully described. So we can look at this object of the temple and be quite fascinated by the object itself. Or we can then again look at the idea of how does that object of the temple fit into the world of the text that we're creating as we read. What's the function of this temple? And particularly because it was never fully built, we don't really have any way to go back and historically compare. So we have an object that's sort of an already not yet type of object. In other words, we have something that I've decided to sort of describe as sacred non-space. Okay, the temple was meant to be where the people will in the future meet with God. Therefore, it's intended to be sacred space. But in the book of Ezekiel itself, it's a sort of non-space. Or we could look at it as a space we're building in our mind as we read, which would have been what Ezekiel's hearers would have done as well. Now, taking a sort of cross-cultural look at this, we can see how humans conceptualize things in different cultures. And that's an interesting kind of tack to take with this particular thing. When I was writing my paper on the temple in the book of Ezekiel and how it compared to the New Testament, I had a friend in Oxford named Jill. Jill was studying Tibetan Buddhism, and we had a long discussion about how Tibetan Buddhism conceives of sacred space. And one thing in particular is the idea of the mandala, which you may have seen people building, for example, a sand mandala and then brushing it away later on. She explained to me the shapes in there are not purely random, that a person in the know, so to speak, would be able to look at those shapes and actually pull them in their mind into a three-dimensional kind of space and then picture themselves walking through it. She talks about an internally conceptualized space where the conceptualizer, the observer, is seeking to encounter the divine. And this is kind of an interesting thought, because I said, well, it's a little bit like the temple in the Old Testament, right? We're going to go in there and get right in the center of it, and the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and really seek to encounter the divine for many purposes. So the idea of a cathedral as an object, okay, we can see a Gothic cathedral, for example, as an object. And to take our term object and replace it with thing, we can look at the work of, excuse me a moment here, Fauconnier and Turner, and talk about how a cathedral a is a thing. So rather than being an object, they use the term thing. But what they say about a cathedral in a discussion about cathedrals and what cathedrals represent is a cathedral is a material anchor for communing with the relatively inaccessible world of the divine and the departed. And it seemed to be a very similar discussion to me to what I had already talked about with my friend Jill about how it's meant to be a place to go and encounter the divine. So we have sort of a, in the sense of a cathedral or a mandala, an actual physical place to go and then conduct this mental or spiritual activity. The interesting thing with the cathedrals is that there are some who would use them as something called a method of loci. In other words, walking through the cathedral space and considering it in their mind and then using it to remember things. So, for example, walking through the door, you would remember the first phrase of your sentence that you wanted to start a discussion with. Walking farther down the aisle, you might remember your second sentence. And so people who did not have useful things like cell phones to record or computers to write into would be giving talks, and they would need to remember them point by point. So this method of loci was meant to create a familiar space that would then allow a person to tag things in order to different places in that space and then be able to produce rhetoric, actually. So it's been used even since the time of Cicero. Now, this is a really interesting thing about cathedrals because many of us are from more of a Protestant tradition, which has gotten rid of objects and pictures, and we meet in other kinds of places which become our sacred places. But can we really say that our big box church has the same ambiance as an ancient cathedral? And that's something to think about. How would we create sacred space today in a space that on the rest of the week is being used? For example, one church I went to, it was in an elementary school, so our space was used as the gym the rest of the time, and yet on Sunday we would gather and create for ourselves sacred space. A cathedral in and of itself seems to have a different sort of memory, living memory, which makes it sort of a repository of things, and sometimes they do have a very interesting ambiance when one actually walks in them. Now, Mary Carruthers, in a book called The Book of Memory and the Art of Memory and How It Works, writes this. One example of this kind of thing involved the monk Peter of Celler, who imagined an entire monastery in this way and invited his audience to enter and use it together with him. Another example she gives, this is the author Mary Carruthers, is to carefully show how each piece of his imaginary building is articulated in the scheme of the entire structure, and how the story and rooms are divided in them to place information in the form of images within these divisions, used as mnemonic loci, in other words, remembering places. Hugh saw this building in his mind as he composed. He walked through it, he used it himself, and he advised others too, as universal cognitive machine. A third example is Augustine of Hippo, who in his sermons painted a literary picture of a tabernacle, and then invited his fellow monks to look around and walk about it with him. Perhaps the most famous example, famous in part because it survives, is the plan of St. Gall, an actual drawing of a plan of a wholly functioning monastic community that provided the ideal space for engaging in liturgical processions and meditation in pursuit of the path to enlightenment. Significantly, though, it was never actually built. It was, in fact, used in imagination by the monks of St. Gall as a space in which to meditate individually and as a community. And the plan of St. Gall then becomes a sort of sacred non-space. It's a space created and used, but not a space that was actually created in a physical way. And this author concludes, in short, the cathedral is developed as a conceptual structure in the blend. He's talking conceptual blending. Before it has an accurate material anchor to support the blend. The material anchor, once constructed, supports the mental activities of monks, but also enables them to communicate that conceptual structure to the lay community and to organize their activities, much as watches and money now organize the actions and interactions of people in a society. Over the centuries, the conception of the cathedral, the building of the cathedral, and the actual use and existence of the cathedral culminate in optimal compression. Now, this is coming straight out of a book called The Way We Think by Gilles Fauconnier and Mark Turner. And the interesting part about it is that it does show some of these connections between both sacred space and sacred non-space. So back to the connection between Tibetan Buddhism and the idea of the mandala and our idea of Ezekiel's temple as a sacred non-space, in other words, a future space where God was going to come and meet with his people, we can return to that question about how does this function within the book? Why is Ezekiel presenting this particular image to the people? Is it possible that he's walking around, kind of walking his readers through the various aspects of what was very important in the previous temple, including, and some of you noticed this in your forum post this week, including the idea of sacrifice. So I read one question was, if this is a future temple, what's the sacrifice doing in there? So Ezekiel's temple is not the final word on this because, of course, after Christ, sacrifices, the blood sacrifices were declared to have been fulfilled in Christ. So we're in some kind of an intermediary spot here prior to Christ, but after the temple was destroyed in Ezekiel. So in searching out a place to encounter the divine, Ezekiel does something kind of similar. Now, interestingly, after I had this conversation in about 2006, I was teaching a class on Ezekiel in our local Fuller outlet here up in Seattle. And one of the students brought in an article from the Catholic Biblical Quarterly from 1986, which I've now uploaded into e-reserves for you. And on page 212 of this article by Susan Ninich, which is called Ezekiel 40 to 48 in a Visionary Context, there's a section called Ezekiel's Mandala, which I thought was very interesting because somehow she had gotten there, of course, before I did, but we both ended up in the same sort of thought world there about what does the mandala do and what does the conceptual idea of Ezekiel's temple do. She's careful to sort out the idea that this is not where Ezekiel directly got an idea. You know, she's not associating the two together, but making this observation that for people seeking the divine, that there's these ways of kind of an intermediary place where that can happen. What she says about the real mandala, it is in a sense the holiest or highest order of the mandala. It's the actual sacred realm. And she goes on to discuss this. And then at the bottom of page 12, she says, integral to the Buddhist mandala tradition is a sophisticated and complex theory of human psychology and physiology. The man-made mandala not only mirrors a heavenly realm, but also reflects the inner structure of each human being. Okay, so she's kind of going about this with the idea that it's a sophisticated sort of maneuver that's happening. And I would say it's a conceptual blend or a conceptual idea in one way. Then she goes on to say the Buddhist attempts to enter the sacred realm and to become, as it were, part of the picture. The Buddhist mystic seeks a palace representing a city, walks through the door, or the city squares and quarters, passes through its gates and doors, observes columns, verandas, and arches in addition to natural bodies and deities. And she's quoting there from somebody named G. Tucci, The Theory and Practice. Okay, so you have this article, which I'm inviting you to read because we'll talk about it for next week's forum post. But she goes on here. The notion of the cosmos as a building or a city is surely universal, one common in the ancient Near East and well attested in scholarship on the first Jerusalem temple and on Old Testament uses of temple imagery. What is surprising is that Ezekiel's vision received by one transported and possessed is usually regarded as stemming from an architectural plan, and in a much too mundane engineering sense, a blueprint, understood in quite a literal way, for a building which is to be constructed. That's from G.A. Cook, The Book of Ezekiel, International Commentary. Okay, and that's kind of an older commentary, 1937. And she goes on one level, Ezekiel's vision is the building. It is the cosmos, as a mandala in each of its orders is a cosmos. Now, this comment written by Ninich here really mirrors an interesting idea that I found writing my thesis about the idea of creating a world. And the text world theory initiator, Paul Wirth, wrote an article, which I thought was really probably the most intriguing title of any of the articles I read, called How to Build a World, and then in parentheses, in a lot less than 6 days, using only what's in your head. Okay, and this is Paul Wirth's original text world idea, where he begins to look at how the text itself helps us to conceptualize a world. So if we look at these ideas of conceptualizing, how are we conceptualizing sacred non-space in the book of Ezekiel? I think we come to an interesting point in that it's not completely useless to even have an unconstructed temple if that unconstructed temple is going to direct people to see God in a new kind of way. And many of you have already observed that the one thing missing from this temple is the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, the position that God would take in the Ark of the Covenant to represent his ultimate point of contact with the people. And instead, he himself is supposed to be in the center of this temple, which is a new way to conceptualize sacred space for the Israelites. So we're dealing with something very interesting here that is not a real thing, probably never was a real thing, but it was very real to Ezekiel, real enough to spend 8 chapters discussing. And I don't think he discussed it to no good end. I think he actually had a real purpose for bringing in this sacred non-space to recording it and to bringing it to the people, because we could think about the ways that it makes some new sense of people who don't have a physical temple to go to. Okay, so he's mentioning each of the things that would be important to them in temple worship and sort of resetting them in a new setting in a way that I think provides a good amount of hope for the people who at this point in time are still kind of between their old home and their new home. And it makes sort of a nice leap then when they do go back, for the idea that, yes, you can create a new temple. Now, those of you who go on to read Ezra and Nehemiah later will realize that the new temple they built was quite a disappointment to some of the people who remembered the previous temple. So the role of Ezekiel's non-space, yet sacred non-space, I think is in that position of providing a way to conceptualize God's grandeur and God's glory in a way that would support and kind of nourish a people who were in exile at that point in time. And the very fact that you can conceive of a sacred non-space, even in exile, is another way that God can be present with these people, even though they're not spot on in on the hill of Jerusalem. And of course, this becomes very important later on, because then that hill was subsequently taken over again. And now we have a sacred space that's kind of doubly shared or triply shared in Jerusalem, with the Dome on the Rock and the Church of the Nativity, which shares services amongst several different kinds of traditions and so forth. So we look at this idea of sacred space, and I'm curious to know how you and your tradition would conceive of sacred space. Does the cathedral tradition resonate with you? The idea of kind of keeping track of times and seasons by different rituals that are performed over a period of time? Does your church tradition follow the church calendar, for example, and make a big distinction between Epiphany and then Lent and then Easter and so forth and so on? Do you have those as teaching times in your church? So one way or the other, does the time, the space, the characters, the objects present in a cathedral or even in a temple resonate with your tradition, or do you sometimes have to recreate sacred space, for example, in a warehouse or up on a mountain in a tent with your group because you went camping on the weekend but decided to stop and have some time for fellowship with God? These are all really interesting kinds of questions and things that, were we in class, I would really love to hear from all of you. But for right now, why don't we drop this topic, and let me just recommend to you to go into e-reserves and pull out, maybe for your weekend reading here, if you're not completely overwhelmed with things, Ezekiel 40 to 48 in a Visionary Context by Susan Niditch. And I will post a forum on Monday where we're going to have some conversation. And I think this particular forum it'll be a pass-fail forum, in the sense that if you participate, you get full credit. So be sure to get in there and actually participate yourself, and then with your group mates. and we'll do it that way this time. Now, one last thing that I like to remind you of is that we have some course reviews, and these are pretty important because the course reviews are really helpful to me to know how to build a course the next time. And so what works and what doesn't work is a really important thing to get some feedback on. So I invite you to do that, and I encourage you to do that by putting a few extra credit points. And there's a space in the last week of class where you can put in just a note, I filled out the course review, which you'll find at the top of your Moodle page. And I believe it comes up when you go to your own student listing, and you can kind of scroll and you'll find it there. So if you have any problems finding it, let me know, and I will have a look for it for you and let you know more fully. But I think it's in a fairly obvious spot right now. So have a really nice weekend. We'll talk to you later. Bye now.